As we discuss food production and the ability of food production to meet the growing demand for food as population increases, we need to consider the environmental effects of food production. There are 5 categories listed on the screen of how food production impacts the environment. The first one is biodiversity loss. The 2 that are the most impacting under biodiversity loss is converting existing habitats such as grasslands and forest and wetlands to farmland, whether that be rangeland or crops. The second one I'd like to point out is loss of agrobiodiversity, because we are planting large acreages of a single crop type or monoculture. This has a ripple effect in impacting biodiversity, because if we plant monocultures, then species like the honeybee is lacking the variety of crops in order to pollinate and survive off of. The second category is soil. Topsoil erosion is a serious problem in many parts of the world. Soil erosion is defined as the movement of soil components, especially surface topsoil, from one place to another by wind or water. There are 2 harmful effects of this. First of all, loss of soil fertility through depletion of the plant nutrients in the topsoil. Hence, it becomes difficult to grow any types of plants in that soil. And then water pollution in nearby surface water bodies, where eroded topsoil ends up in the stream or the river as sediment. This can impact the breeding grounds for fish, clog irrigation ditches, and also create habitat impact within the streams themselves for aquatic species. When you mix over-farming of a land area with seasons of dry periods, you end up with something called desertification. Basically, drought and human activities can degrade the topsoil to the point where there isn't any nutrients remaining in the soil, and then it lacks the ability to be productive in any way for plants. And the end result is that basically the area appears as a desert. We had this happen in the United States during the Great Dust Bowl period. Due to the intense industrialized agricultural methods that we currently use, the FAO estimated that almost 70% of the world's arid and semi-arid lands used for agriculture are degraded and threatened by this desertification. The third category is for water. Obviously, if you're going to grow crops, you need water to irrigate those crops. But excessive irrigation has serious consequences. Roughly 20% of the world's cropland that is irrigated produces about 45% of the world's food. Most irrigation water is a dilute solution of water salts that are picked up as the water flows through the soil and over the rocks. Repeated annual applications of this irrigation water in dry climates leads to a gradual accumulation of salt in the upper soil layers. This is a soil degradation process that's called salinization. It actually stunts crop growth, lowers crop yields, and can eventually kill plants and ruin land. Severe salinization has reduced yields by at least 10% in the world's irrigated cropland, and almost 25% of the irrigated cropland in the U.S., especially in the western states. Irrigation can also cause waterlogging, in which water accumulates underground and gradually raises the water table. At least 1/10 of the world's irrigated land suffers from waterlogging, and the problem is starting to get worse. In addition, you've got to get the water from somewhere, so if you're pulling from the groundwater system or from a nearby stream or river, it can deplete those water supplies. Another major impact associated with water in agriculture is that when you have excessive nutrients running off of farms from over application of fertilizer, or because there's a lot of manure waste on the farm, those nutrients get into the nearby streams and then end up in nearby estuaries, and they cause what are called algal blooms, which will die, and as those algal blooms die, they deplete the oxygen out of the water, and it kills the fish by not having enough oxygen. So agriculture also contributes to air pollution and projected climate change. The agricultural activities can contribute to climate change because of greenhouse gas emissions. There's carbon dioxide that's coming from fossil fuel use with the tractors and the different types of equipment. There's nitrogen that's coming from inorganic fertilizer use. And there's methane that's coming from livestock, particularly cattle. Agriculture currently accounts for more than 25% of the human-generated emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The industrialized livestock production on CAFOs alone generates about 18% of the world's greenhouse gases, particularly the methane. Cattle and dairy cows release greenhouse gas methane, and methane is generated by liquid animal manure that's stored in waste lagoons as well. Nitrous oxide, which is about 300 times the warming capacity of carbon dioxide per molecule, is released in large quantities by synthetic inorganic fertilizers as well, and also by livestock manure. So agriculture can contribute to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Finally, in regards to human health, there is concern for over-application of fertilizers and the accumulation of nitrates in groundwater supplies in regions that are heavily farmed. Nitrates in drinking water can cause what's known as the blue baby syndrome, where it depletes the flow of oxygen in the blood. Also, you have concerns with pesticide residues in water, food, and air, and dealing with livestock wastes. So with some of these impacts on the environment, the farming community has taken up what's known as best management practices, or BMPs, to try to alleviate some of these environmental impacts. One of the BMPs focuses strictly on soil conservation. And what happens is the farmers use methods of terracing on different elevation levels for creating the crop areas, contour planting, where they basically plow the land in parallel to the topography of the area, strip cropping, where they alternate various strips of tilled soil with some that remain vegetated and obviously some that is freshly tilled, and this helps reduce soil erosion. Planting cover crops in fields which are in a season of not being used because they need to replenish the nutrients in the soil. So instead of just letting that field lay barren without any vegetation, what they'll do is they'll plant a specific cover crop that helps render more nutrients back into the soil. And then also setting up windbreaks with different types of tree species along the perimeter of the fields that help minimize wind erosion. In addition, they can use alley cropping and agroforestry, which is planting crops in orchards, as well as tillage farming to reduce soil erosion. When the farms use organic fertilizer, such as animal manure or compost, to restore soil fertility, this helps maintain the nutrient balance within the soil and also maintain a good crop yield. Maintaining the nutrient balance in the soil is a key to reducing soil erosion and increasing soil fertility. Reducing irrigation dependence is also important because it helps protect our surface water and groundwater resources also. Genetically modified foods have been seen as a potential solution to solving world hunger. However, there is great controversy over using genetically engineered foods. Genetic engineered crop yields seem to be no higher than traditional crop yields, based on some studies. Long-term potential harm to human health and ecosystems is unknown, and there's concern that employing genetic modified organisms will reduce the genetic biodiversity of non-genetically modified seeds as a result of potential cross-pollination. The top 10 genetically modified foods are pictured on the screen. Corn, soy, cottonseed, papaya, rice, canola, potatoes, tomatoes, various dairy products, and peas fall into this category. The big breakthrough for genetically modified organisms happened in 1973. Two scientists named Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen worked together to produce the first genetically engineered organism. They were able to cut out a gene from one organism and insert it into another. The gene they transferred was one that was encoded for antibiotic resistance. So by putting it into another organism, they were able to give this new genetically modified organism antibiotic resistance. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed patenting of genetically engineered organisms. It patented a genetically engineered bacteria that could break down crude oil to help with oil spill mitigation. By 1982, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved Humulin, the first pharmaceutical produced through genetic engineering. And it wasn't until 1992 that the Flavor Savor tomatoes became the first food crop to be approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for human consumption. In 1995, the first insecticide-producing crop was approved by the U.S. EPA. A crop known as HT crops, or herbicide-tolerant crops, were developed, and these were developed to survive application of specific herbicides that previously would have destroyed the crop, along with the targeted weeds. Herbicides basically kill weeds. So this provided farmers with a broader variety of options for effective weed control. Based on the U.S. Department of Ag survey data, HT soybeans went from 17% of the U.S. soybean acreage in 1997 to 68% in 2001 and 94% in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And that's depicted on the graphic on the screen in front of you with the blue line, the light blue line, that soybean genetically modified HT soybeans was low in the 1996 timeframe and then just continued an increasing trend up to the present, where about 94% of our soybeans are considered genetically modified. Plantings of HT cotton expanded from about 10% of the U.S. acreage in 1997, and we're looking at the green line on the graph now, to about 56% in 2001 and 91% in 2014. There was a slight decline to 89% in 2015 and 2016. So we also have HT cotton, and again, this is an herbicide-tolerant crop which has been genetically modified so that herbicides can be sprayed on the field to kill the weeds, but yet the cotton stands remaining unaffected. The adoption of HT corn has been slower in previous years, but has recently accelerated, reaching about 89% of the U.S. corn acreage by 2016. And HT corn is in orange on the graph. We also have genetically modified crops that work for being insect-resistant crops. These insect-resistant crops contain a gene from the soil bacterium Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis. These have been available for corn and cotton since 1996. This genetically modified crop basically incorporates a bacteria that produces a protein that is toxic to specific insects, which then protects the plant over its entire life. So you basically have created a insect repellent corn and cotton that if an insect tries to eat it, it will kill that insect. Currently, there is no version of a Bt soybean at this time. As depicted on the screen in front of you, there are trade-offs for genetically modified crops and foods. There's advantages and disadvantages, which we will discuss in more detail. So with genetically modified crops, they might need less fertilizer and pesticides, maybe even less water, because we can genetically engineer them to grow in drought-like conditions. In addition, the food can last longer. They can be resistant to insects, disease, drought, and frost. They can increase food supply because they grow faster. They can use less land for farming because they have a higher yield per plant. And they can definitely be used to help fight hunger in other countries because they're resilient to drought and harsh weather. And finally, we can use some medicinal applications for these genetically modifieds. Some disadvantages include having unpredictable genetic and ecological impacts. They could put toxins into our food that could have long-term impact on human health. They could promote pesticide-resistant insects and herbicide-resistant weeds, as well as plant diseases, and they could disrupt the seed market and reduce biodiversity, also known as disrupting gene flow.